Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America. On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, we talk to prominent US citizens not just about their country's past and present, but also about its future. What, I ask my American guests, will be the 21st century fate of their now venerable republic? Hello everybody, welcome back to Keen on America. We're on the road, appropriately enough, with a guest, Francis S. Barry, who himself has been on the road. He has a new book out, Back Roads and Better Angels, A Journey into the Heart of American Democracy. His name is Francis S. Barry. He's based in New York City, works with Michael Bloomberg, and we're speaking to you from the Bloomberg offices on Lexington Avenue in the heart of Manhattan. Frank, congratulations on the new book. On Keen on America, I'd like to get a sense of where our guests were born in America. Tell me a little bit about your background. Where are you from?
I was born about 30 miles outside of New York City, northwest up the Hudson River, a little town called Suffern, and grew up there before moving to New York City after college. My father was from the Bronx, mother from Baltimore.
And do you think, I know this is a rather dumb question, but excuse it, do you think of yourself as an American?
I do. I do think of myself as an American and also as a New Yorker. I think that anyone who has lived in New York for more than a few days is a New Yorker, and that's part of what makes the city special. But yeah, absolutely think of myself as an American.
What does that mean, thinking of yourself as an American?
That's a great question. It's one that I explore in the book. The meaning of the answer to that question is something that is really at the heart of what the country is. That we've been wrestling with this question really from our very beginning of what it means to be an American and who's included in the American project. And we've had fights over that for 240 some years, and we still are. There was, I mentioned in the book, Lincoln's definition of what it means to be an American is probably best summed up by his phrase, his use of the phrase, there's an electric cord that runs between us and the Declaration of Independence and its promise of equality to all. And he says that cord is what connects us to the founders, whether we came here or our families came here on the Mayflower, or whether we came as immigrants yesterday.
Could one argue, Frank, that this debate about what it means to be an American was certainly present even before independence, during independence, after independence, during the Civil War, during the New Deal, during the Progressive Era, and that that's what continues to define America now, is a debate amongst Americans about what it means to be American?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And the debate hasn't been settled. The whole history of the country in many ways can be told around struggles over that debate, whether black people should be included as Americans, whether women should be given the rights of American citizenship, and so whether immigrants should be entitled to those rights, how long they should have to wait for them. These are all debates that we've been having for 200 plus years and are still having.
And does that distinguish America certainly from European countries and other Asian countries where there has always been history? There is no beginning, no empty slate. So America is distinguished from other countries because there was that empty slate. Of course, we all know now it wasn't really an empty slate, but seen as one, a new beginning.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think it's fair to say America is the first country to be founded on an idea, not on an ethnicity or on the divine right of a king. but on the idea, as Lincoln said, that electric cord, that promise of equality for all. And that does, when we, the phrase American exceptionalism can often be overused, but that's, I think, essentially what it is, that the country is founded on ideas and values, and of course there are conflicts over what they are and how they should be applied, and to whom they should be applied.
It's interesting, Frank, that you bring up Lincoln, of course, who was a mid-19th century president. Do you think the founders all agree that America was founded on the ideal of equality? I'm not convinced. Certainly Alexander Hamilton would have agreed with that.
Well, it is in the founding document, and so the issue, I don't think, is whether they believed in equality so much as who it applied to. And so there were states that at the time of the founding did not allow Catholics to hold office, for instance. Of course, women were not considered equal. Of course, blacks were not considered equal. And so the founders had their own, and of course within the founders there was a diversity of opinion on what equality should entail. But yeah, our definition of equality, of course, isn't the same as it was 200 years ago, but that's not to say that they didn't believe, that they didn't kind of plant this seed that has grown and flourished and allowed that definition of equality to be extended ever outward.
Do you think Americans then, or America, invented the promise, the idea, or perhaps the ideal of equality?
I don't think we invented the idea of equality, or that the founders invented it. They were borrowing from philosophers, European philosophers, Locke and Montesquieu and others. But the first to apply it to the Constitution, to apply it so directly in a Declaration of Independence, yes, I think that, and I think that the inclusion of that principle as a defining principle is what has shaped and been so central to our growth and success as a country. Without it, America doesn't look anything today like it otherwise would.
The ideal, the promise of equality, was one that was embraced certainly by many observers of America, in particular Alexis Tocqueville. You've done your own Tocqueville with this new book. You've gone out into America. Have you been very influenced by de Tocqueville, both his ideas on what democracy in America means and, of course, his travels in 19th century America? Yeah,
the tradition of going out and exploring America runs back to Tocqueville and even before, to get a better understanding of the country. He was a foreigner doing it, but lots of Americans have gone on this same search, from Fitzgerald to Steinbeck. So there are lots of great, the American genre of travel literature, I think, is as rich as you could possibly imagine a country's travel literature could be. And so I think following in those going out on the road and following that tradition, of course I absorbed as much of that literature as I could, de Tocqueville included. What people most remember about de Tocqueville was his insight that America was a country of joiners, that we were constantly forming associations for the improvement of communities. And that really did hold true and has held true over the course of much of our history. And there's been lots of commentary in the last few decades around how healthy is that tradition today. And so there have been lots of social analyses and papers written, studies done around whether or not we are losing that tradition, and if so, what it means to the health of the country.
The bowling alone thesis.
Exactly, the Robert Putnam bowling alone.
Bob Putnam's been on the show a couple of times. The subtitle of your new book, Frank, Backroads and Better Angels, is A Journey into the Heart of American Democracy. You haven't really talked about the D word. You've talked about the E word, equality. Tocqueville, of course, wrestled with whether or not democracy and equality, or egalitarianism, or the egalitarianism he observed in the America of the mid-19th century, were compatible. What's your take on this? Is there a natural association or disassociation between ideals of democracy and equality?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that the founders wrestled with too, and that's how we got the Electoral College. They were afraid of democracy in its purest form. And so, because, of course, Madison especially obsessed with controlling factions, and that's how, we get provisions built into the Constitution to prevent the trampling of rights of the minority. And so, yeah, there are those good reasons for those concerns that the founders under Tocqueville had around the dangers of democracy. But within 2 election cycles, the Electoral College had essentially become a dead letter. And the whole history of the country unfolds as, I think, as a continuation of an extending of what democracy means and who can participate. And so you get ever broader voting, ever widening voting rights. You get in the progressive era the end of the Senate chosen by the House of by state legislators. The members of the Senate for 100 and some years were chosen by state legislatures. So democracy is continually being refined over the course of American history. But that question that Tocqueville and others raise is still very much with us, and it's not. We would be foolish to think that we have overcome the threat that lies within democracy.
And of course, the Tocqueville and the founders knew their theorists and historians of antiquity and of the Middle Ages, and they understood the dangers of mob rule, some more than others, certainly Madison. Jefferson seems to be torn. Does, in your view, the ideal of American democracy, does that require representation? This was, of course, an issue that was debated, fought out by the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Does it require that people don't rule themselves directly?
Well, we have a hybrid version of that. So we have a mostly representative democracy, but we also have a federalist system where state governments control, or at least have authority over, much of our what we would consider to be our lives. And the rule of law that governs them. And so there is direct democracy in some states where we have, in some cities, people are constantly voting on ballot measures and referendum. We have that in New York, you have it in San Francisco. Lots of states have a version of that statewide. And so, there are people who argue that that has been a problem, that is a destructive force within a society. And there are people in the UK who would argue that it was a huge mistake to put Brexit to the ballot. Lots of people take the other side of that. But in the US, you've got a hybrid version where you have a mostly direct democracy at the federal level, and then at the state level there is the freedom to experiment with, and this idea of experimentation is really crucial and I think central to American democracy. The old line that Brandeis used about states being the laboratories of democracy, well, this is an example of that, holding essentially plebiscites on laws that give people greater authority over their government.
Frank, you've mentioned Lincoln a couple of times already. We talked about Madison, Hamilton. I noted earlier that you've spent a lot of your life working for Mayor Michael Bloomberg. Do you have American heroes? Is Lincoln the great hero of this new book, Backroads and Better Angels? Is he the better angel in the American narrative?
He is, and there's so much that we can learn from Lincoln. Lincoln used that phrase to inspire us to look within for our own better angels, and the idea of the book is try to use him to help draw them out. But there's so much of Lincoln, which is why both parties have gravitated to him and claimed him as their own. You have presidents, of course, the Republicans will say that the GOP is the party of Lincoln, and of course there's truth in that. But Democratic presidents have been claiming him at least since FDR, and it's because of the universal values that he embodies for people. It's because, of course, that he, more than anyone, is responsible for holding the country together during the Civil War. But what I try to do in the book is to draw out some of the universal and timeless values that he represented at a time when we most needed them, and apply them to current contemporary politics at a time when we, again, really need them.
If Lincoln is the positive shadow in your reading of America and in this book, is there a negative one? I don't want to talk about Donald Trump yet, perhaps, but are there particular figures in American history who, for you, represent the anti-Lincoln?
Well, the easiest, most obvious answer there is the Confederacy, and everyone who, Jefferson Davis on down, who argued for splitting the country, that the country could not survive what Lincoln represented. And what did he represent? It wasn't an end to slavery, it was an end to the extension of slavery. And so, we've had lots of debates over Confederate monuments over the past few years. Often forgotten in the veneration of Robert E. Lee is that most Army colonels and officers of his rank and most other Army leaders did not, from the South, did not abandon the Union. And so the un-Lincoln are those who are kind of quick to see reason to end the American project, quick to see things being so bad that they are irredeemable, that the country cannot be saved as it exists under this political leader. Before Lincoln had done anything, just by virtue of his election, there were states that were ready to secede. And you hear a little bit of that echoed today, that, oh, the country could not possibly survive another Biden or Trump presidency. And part of the idea of the book is to show that our resilience extends far beyond elections and extends far beyond individual politicians, and really is rooted in our values.
So I'm guessing that you weren't very pleased when, in January 6th, young men, middle-aged men, ran around the Capitol waving Confederate flags.
I certainly was not. In addition to Confederate flags, many of them were also waving Christian flags. And one of the things that I explore in the book is how that was overlooked and misunderstood at the time, how central, though, Christian nationalism and evangelical churches were to the Stop the Steal movement and to the January 6th attack on the Capitol. And the forces of Christian nationalism mistaking Christian worship for political power really was at the heart of so much of the January 6th movement. And of course, we're seeing a version of that play out today as Trump's political rallies take on an increasingly religious tone.
The book comes with, I'm counting now, Frank, 7 or 8 single-line pages of a select bibliography. So you're very well read, particularly in American history. Before we get to the book, and particularly the America of the 2020s, have there been moments, in your view, in the past, aside from the Civil War, where American democracy might be seen to be in crisis?
Certainly, and you could argue that American democracy was in crisis for a very large part of the population for 100 years after the Civil War. Black Americans could not vote in much of the country.
So it really didn't exist.
It didn't exist. It didn't exist for many, many citizens for 100 years after their freedom had been won and their civil rights supposedly secured. So America, there's never been a golden age of democracy where everything was hunky-dory. There has always been a fight for democratic rights. And you could use a similar analogy with immigrants. There have been different waves of anti-immigrant fervor, from the know-nothings of Lincoln's era to the isolationism of the 1920s to what we're experiencing today. And in the 1920s, the fervor of anti-immigration sentiment really was instrumental in reviving the Ku Klux Klan. And so the Klan, in addition to being very anti-black, of course, was also anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic. And there was an effort to roll back the clock on democratic rights and deny immigrants voting rights, deny Catholics employment and other rights. And so there's been no one particular period of crisis in American democracy. The whole history is essentially an unfolding battle.
A few days ago, we had the historian Stephen Johnson on the show. He has a new book out about the threat to American democracy coming not from the right, although I don't think he would deny there was a threat from the right, but from the left, from the violent anarchists like Emma Goldman. Do you think that the left, or the radical left, certainly the anarchist and communist left, has also historically represented a threat to American democracy, or has that often been exaggerated by people paranoid about the left? McCarthy, of course, comes to mind.
No, I think it's very hard to argue that it's exaggerated. If you look at, as I'm sure Stephen Johnson explored on your show, just the acts of violence themselves. There's a long history of violent attacks. In the very first pages of the book, we came across one down on Wall Street, an attack on the JP Morgan bank, which left 30 people dead, and it was an anti-capitalist anarchist attack, though they never caught those who perpetrated it. So yeah, of course there's a long history of violent radicalism and anti-democratic radicalism on the left, and one of the things I try to do in the book is to show that it hasn't died, that the left is very eager to say that all the threats to democracy exist on the right, and of course January 6th and what it represents and what it could represent again is a fundamental serious threat. But threats to democratic rights exist on the left too, and we saw that play out to some extent in 2020 with the excesses of the BLM protests and the excesses of the protests that followed it, and Antifa's involvement in some of it, what happened in Portland, and more broadly even, some of the left's unwillingness to countenance dissent, and the danger to free speech that represents, which is a topic that we explore in the book too.
We've been very patient, Frank. We're going to get to the book specifically, but one final question, one final history question I'm curious as to your take on before we get to the book. What about the 60s? Well, some people see the 60s as a moment of the flowering of American democracy, of a more direct, immersive, passionate, democratic moment, the rebellion against the Vietnam War, the beginnings of a youthful politic. Others, particularly conservatives, see it as a dangerous moment for American democracy. What's your take on the 60s and its legacy?
Well, that's a tough one to do quickly. Both of those things, I think, can be true. It was a disruption to society in both good and bad ways. That lots of good came out of of course, the civil rights movement and the movement for free speech. The Lincoln Highway, to jump a little bit to the book, the Lincoln Highway runs through Altamont in California, which is, of course, where the rock concert in 1969 in December ended in the death with the beating of an attendee by a Hell's Angel. And people sometimes call that the end of the 60s, because in that take on it, the 60s represents peace and love and the flowering of this new American ideal. And I actually think that Altamont was a better representation of what the 60s were. There was plenty of violence that was part of the counterculture, always had been. And Woodstock kind of helped let people, and the Summer of Love helped people pretend that it didn't exist, that those dark undercurrents didn't exist in the counterculture of the 60s. And of course, they were always there, and sometimes, like at Altamont, they came out.
So you're not particularly nostalgic for the 60s. Is there a decade in American history of American democracy that you are nostalgic for?
No, because there's been, if you were to pick, say, the 50s, well, what did the 50s represent for black Americans? What did the 50s represent for gay Americans? So you would be insane to be nostalgic for that period if you were black or gay. And if you were a woman who was denied opportunities outside the house. So the idea that there is a ideal decade in American history, I think, runs counter to what American history is, which is a struggle over an ever widening circle of rights and opportunities for people. So no, I'm not a nostalgic kind of longing. I don't long for an America that has come and gone. But I will say that's a really important political force in American history, and we hear it now. Make America Great Again. It's a line that Reagan had used before Trump, but it's also a line that we hear echoed a century ago in American political discourse. There has been, almost from the beginning, a sense of nostalgia for an idealized America that has never existed, but that people hold up in lamenting what has become of American culture. So there's, for instance, lots of that around immigration. There's lots of sentiment in the early 1900s. Oh, well, we missed the golden age when there weren't so many Southern Europeans in the country, when there weren't so many Catholics in the country. But that's a reoccurring, that sentiment is a reoccurring theme in American politics.